From about the 1970s right up until last decade, we were in an era of hyper-globalization. By hyper-globalization, I mean that the world was getting interconnected at a furious pace. And there are sort of four metrics that you can look at this. One has to do with trade. Trade as a share of global GDP expanded massively from the 1970s right up until last decade. Capital flows between countries expanded humongously in the 1980s, 90s, reaching a crescendo just before the global financial crisis of last year. Migration flows also expanded. And then the fourth one, digital flows, the interconnectivity that we saw in the world because of the rise of the internet and the flows that took place online of information. But what started to happen this decade is, and this is very important, this predates Trump. Trump for me is not somebody who is sort of, like a person who's facilitating deglobalization, but somebody who's a symptom of it. Because if you look at all these four metrics had began to go into reverse gear well before Trump came into power. Trade as a share of global GDP has been declining this decade because various countries are putting up more and more non-tariff barriers or tariff barriers well before Trump came to power. Capital flows as a share of global GDP have declined a lot this decade because of the fact that banks have been much more reluctant to lend cross borders following the 2008 financial market meltdown. Migrant flows have slowed down. We know this very well. Even between US and Mexico, migrant flows have slowed down considerably. And fourth, even on the digital side, we're seeing a sort of balkanization of the internet as well, which is the fact that China is sort of forming its own universe and its companies trying to sort of form their own orbit, making more investments into countries from India to Indonesia as they try and sort of match up to the big tech giants of the United States. And if you go to China today, it really is a completely different existence. You cannot use any of the sort of daily sort of apps that we use here, or things like Google, Facebook, everything out there is banned when you go to China. And they have their own universe and like in terms of how they do things and what they use, as you all well know. And they're pretty happy with it in terms of pretty self-sufficient with that, at least from what I can detect out there. So it's quite incredible that, like we talk about digital like interconnectivity, and yet this balkanization has happened between these two sort of powers out there. So I think that no matter what happens in March or April, I feel this trend of deglobalization will last for a while because that's the natural ebb and flow, which is that you get a very powerful trend of globalization and then you get some backlash to it. And that backlash is what Trump is a symptom of in terms of what's happening across the world. So I think that lasts. We saw a similar sort of hyper-globalization take place in the late 19th century. And then in the interwar period, we saw a massive retreat from that in what was an era of deglobalization. I think we are in a similar era which started just after the global financial crisis, and something which is likely to last for a while rather than end with one trade agreement or one trade deal, even if it's struck in the optimistic scenario between US and China in March or April.